you may or may not have heard of this type of review before. I think I like to consider it as the new kid on the block in terms of systematic review methodology. They, as I'll talk you through, they are very important systematic reviews. They're, I guess, increasingly been recognised how important they are, but the methodology, I guess, has evolved quite significantly over recent years and continues to evolve. In terms of the terminology, is quite important. I'll be talking a bit about terminology throughout the presentation today. Sometimes these are called psychometric systematic reviews. You might have heard of the term psychometrics. Psychometrics, measurement properties, it means the same thing. Our methodology group has determined that officially we're going to call these systematic reviews of measurement properties, which I will explain why in a minute. But I'll probably be using the term psychometrics as well quite a bit throughout the talk, and sometimes you will see these called psychometric reviews. So let's start with a few disclosures. I'm a research fellow at JBI. I am the chair of the JBI Psychometric Methodology Group. So this group started probably about 5 years ago now. We've been dabbling in this, and I've learned a lot in that time. I had to put on there that I am not a psychometric expert. Prior to taking on leading this group, I had no real experience in psychometrics, didn't really know much about it. I had an interest in it and just kind of jumped in. And so I've learned a lot in that time. It's been a steep learning curve a lot of the time. I still don't consider myself an expert, but I wanted to just make that point that you don't have to be a psychometric expert to undertake a systematic review of measurement properties. They can seem a bit daunting at times. They're quite technical in a lot of aspects. But as I'll show you, in a lot of ways, they are similar to other systematic reviews as well. So I'm going to start off by talking through what they are, and then I'll take you through a kind of step-by-step process about how you would actually undertake one of these. I'm not expecting many of you will probably never want to do a systematic review of this kind, but I think it's important that hopefully after the talk today, you will at least have an understanding about them. If you happen to read one, you'll be able to understand what it's showing and the importance of them. And hopefully for those of you who are clinicians and or researchers, that this will get you thinking about some of the measurement instruments that you might use on a daily basis and the importance of those measurement instruments. Okay, so it's a bit of terminology. I quickly learned terminology for these review types is very important. Firstly, we're talking about measurement instruments. So what do we mean a measurement instrument? It's quite a broad definition. So it's a device used to collect a measurement. And so that could be anything ranging from questionnaires, observations, scales, interviews, laboratory tests, images. So essentially anything that you use to measure something has properties, and that's what we're interested in these review types, is the measurement properties of those instruments. Traditionally, it's been thought of, you probably might have heard of this term before, PROMs, patient-reported outcome measures. That's traditionally what I guess psychometrics has looked at is the properties regarding PROMs, but there's other categories of measurement instrument outcomes that we're also interested in looking at. So it might be clinician-reported outcomes, performance-based outcomes, and even laboratory values. Most of the early methodology was focused on PROMs, but there's been some in recent years emerging methodologies about looking at properties of these other outcomes too. Okay, now I mentioned the term psychometrics previously. Psychometrics has, I guess, differing definitions. So it was one of the reasons why our methodology group decided not to call these psychometric systematic reviews, is that the definition of psychometrics was quite varied. It's been used, I guess, traditionally in the field of psychology. So it's traditionally for looking at measurement of instruments in psychology. hence the work by psychometrics. But it's now become to have a much broader meaning that it's measurement properties of any instrument. But then there's also this definition where it's actually only for instruments that have items of equal weighting. And then there's, I guess, a related term of clinometrics, which is for instruments where there might be major or minor items or something's present or absent. And due to this confusion, we thought, well, it's a much better term just to say systematic reviews of measurement properties, which kind of captures nicely what we're talking about in this hopefully limited confusion. So why would you want to do one of these systematic reviews? Well, one of the main reasons is that the measurement instrument in any research is vital. It's crucial. So if you're conducting research with instruments of poor quality or unknown quality, it's considered a waste of resources, because you could design the best randomized controlled trial in the world. You could, have the best randomization process, minimize all the bias, but when you come to measuring the result, if you're using an instrument that's not actually giving you accurate readings, then the rest of the research is meaningless. In the same way, if you're using instruments in clinical practice, if you're using something that's not actually giving you good measurement for what you're wanting to measure, well, you're not going to get optimal outcomes for the patients. So it's actually a really important thing to be looking at is what instruments are we using? Are they valid to be used in the context that they're being used in? So the goal from conducting a systematic review of measurement properties is that hopefully you might identify that there is a gold standard instrument that's available to use. That'd be great. Sometimes you'll find that maybe instruments are valid in some settings and contexts, but not others. And quite often you might also find there's a gap in knowledge that there is actually no reliable, valid instrument that exists, and one needs to be developed. And that's still a useful finding from one of these systematic reviews. Okay, so when we talk about measurement properties, there are three major domains of measurement properties that we're looking at. You've probably heard of these, or at least two of these, which are validity and reliability. So you can see in the little diagram below here what we mean by, so in this first target here, it's showing this would be an instrument that is reliable in that it's consistent, it's giving results that are all grouped together nicely. The problem is it's not considered to be valid because it's not centered around our target. It's not actually measuring what we want to be measuring, which is here in the bullseye. Likewise, here you can see all these measurement points here are centered around the target. So it might be considered valid that it's trying to measure the right thing, but that it's not reliable because they're so spread out that they're giving different measurements every time. Here we have the example where it is not valid because it's not centered on the target, and it's also not reliable because it's spread out. So ideally, this is what we want for a measurement instrument, one that is reliable and valid. The other domain that I'm going to talk about is responsiveness, and essentially this is the ability of an instrument to detect a change over time. All right, so one of the first points of call for our methodology group was to look at what resources are already existing in this field. As I said, it's been an emerging field over recent years. There is an organisation called COSMIN, and they're, I guess, the leading organisation in this area. And you can see here's a kind of a landmark study published in 2010. So they reached an international consensus for a taxonomy, terminology, and definitions of measurement properties. So this was kind of an important step in this field because up to this point, everyone was using different definitions and terminologies, and it was all a bit of a mess. So the COSMIN group was, I guess, vital in trying to bring some consistency to the field. After publishing this paper, they then went on to develop a risk of bias checklist, which I'll talk about more soon, but it's considered the benchmark checklist in this field for assessing risk of bias of these kinds of studies. So I mentioned the taxonomy, the COSMIN taxonomy. this is what it is. So you can see in blue are the three major domains which I talked about. Within those the domains there are subdomains, and within those domains there are a further categories. So you see it is quite complex. These have particular definitions. So COSMIN has standardized definitions for these. The problem is that not everyone has been using the same definitions. Sometimes a paper will you have to try and work out what exactly they're talking about, which measurement property they're interested in, because they haven't adhered to this standard. So hopefully this now will become more of a standard. People will start using more standardized terminologies and make this field a bit more easier to follow. You can see there's interpretability stuck here down the bottom, which it's not strictly a measurement property, but it is important consideration in systematic reviews of measurement properties, and I'll talk more about that shortly. So that brings me on to the JBI methodological guidance for these kinds of reviews. As you can see here, we've got a chapter in the JBI Manual for Evidence Synthesis. We are the new kid on the block, so we're down here at chapter 12. And here you can see the other members of the group that were involved in working with me on this methodology. So I'm going to take you through, I guess, a few of the key steps in undertaking one of these systematic reviews. Firstly, the title. So the title should state that it is a systematic review of measurement properties, to make it clear. So here's a few examples that you might have. So screening instruments for frailty, self-record instruments to identify anxiety in pregnancy, measuring functional performance following stroke. So you can see these first three, we haven't actually named an instrument. It's about looking at what instruments are out there, whereas this last one is the confusion assessment method. We've actually named an instrument we want to actually look at. So you can, I guess, decide on how broad or narrow scope the review want to have for the review, as to whether you're interested in looking at all instruments or just a selection or just the one. Now, inclusion criteria. So these are very important. I remember one of the things that first got me interested in these kinds of reviews is I was peer reviewing a systematic review for the JBI journal, and it was a bit of a mess. I could tell it had potential, but the inclusion criteria were very confusing. And this was before we had guidance for how to conduct these types of reviews. And so I was trying to make a systematic review of measurement properties fit with an effectiveness PICO, and it was just it was a weird hybrid that didn't make much sense. But I could tell that it would be an interesting review. So that's kind of what got me interested in looking at, well, actually there is a review type that can be used to look at this and answer these questions. So we do recommend the mnemonic PICO also, but it has slightly different meaning than an effectiveness PICO. So we want to know the population, including the setting, which is important for when you're using measurement instruments. The I stands for the instruments, which, as I said, can be a type of instrument or a specific named instrument. Construct is what is being measured. And the outcomes that we're interested in are actually the measurement properties of the instrument. Any studies can potentially be considered for inclusion, but typically the studies that go into these reviews are studies that have developed an instrument and or validated. All right, so just looking at the searching, searching is quite similar to as what you'd undertake for any other kind of systematic review. It's suggested to use index terms and text terms. One of the main differences is that the kinds of studies can be a bit difficult to find. So the validation studies and the instrument development studies can be a bit hard to pull out from everything else. So the COSMIN group has developed quite a number of search filters that can be helpful with this, that are designed to find those validation and development studies. And they're available for a range of databases. Okay, critical appraisal. So I mentioned briefly before that the COSMIN group has developed what's considered the benchmark risk of bias checklist for assessing these kinds of validation and instrument development studies. So as a methodology group, we decided that there was no point trying to develop something of our own. We did look at, people have tried to simplify this because it is a very complicated tool to use in a way. It's very, I guess, so for most systematic reviews, you assess at a study level, you assess the study for its quality. In this case, the COSMIN tool assesses at the study level, but we actually do a checklist for each measurement property. So it can get really long and quite complex, and people have tried to simplify it, but when we looked into it, we decided that, well, it actually needs to be this complicated because in order to actually effectively measure assess the risk of bias, we need this checklist, and it is the benchmark. So we decided to recommend using it. And when you look into it further, it's quite structured in a way, and once you understand it, it's not too hard to follow. There are 10 boxes, as you can see here, but you only need to complete a box for a study if the article's actually looked at that measurement property. So a lot of times you don't complete all of them. The COSMIN group has quite detailed guidance about how to interpret the criteria. So this is just an example. Within the content validity box, items are rated ranging from very good to inadequate, and for each measurement property there is a worst score counts principle. So for instance, if number 1 here was inadequate, then we would say that the content validity was inadequate. I'm quickly going to flip through these. I'm not going to spend too long on them, but there are templates available for filling out these. So like other systematic reviews, it's recommended to have 2 reviewers rating independently and then reach consensus on the ratings. So you can see here, this is box 1 for the design of the measurement instrument. This is for box 2 for content validity, which is considered probably the most important measurement property. Content validity is the instrument measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. So you can see there's quite a lot of criteria around that. And then the other ones, the other boxes. So the appraisal does take a substantial amount of time, but I think once you understand it, it does get easier, I found. Okay, so moving on to data extraction. I've just put in a example data extraction template at the bottom there. The kinds of things we want to know about are the characteristics of the sample, details of the instruments, and of course the results of the measurement properties. I briefly mentioned interpretability earlier. It's not strictly a measurement property, but interpretability and feasibility are also important aspects to consider when looking at measurement properties. Interpretability really just means, how easy is it to understand, like how can a qualitative meaning be assigned to the quantitative number so how easy it is to make sense of the result the measurement is giving us. And feasibility is an important consideration. So you can see some of the aspects under feasibility. Can the patient understand? How long does it take to complete? Is it freely available? Is it copyrighted? Things like that. So I guess there's no point recommending an instrument. It might have good measurement properties, but if it's not actually feasible to implement, then it's potentially not useful. Okay, data synthesis. Mostly systematic reviews of measurement properties will use a narrative synthesis. There is some situations where meta-analysis is possible. It's still, I guess, this is part of the field that is still emerging, is when you can use meta-analysis. A lot of times it's difficult to do it. I will show you, this is an example of meta-analysis from a systematic review that I found. So you can see here what they're actually meta-analysed is Cronbach alpha, which is a measure of internal consistency relating to the reliability. So you can see if you have enough, if you have enough studies that have looked at the same outcome, it's possible to do a meta-analysis for some of the measurement properties. Okay, the other thing to consider, so say you've done a meta-analysis or whether you've just done a narrative synthesis, we need to know whether the result that we get, whether that is considered sufficient for it to recommend the measurement instrument or not. So COSMIN have put together this table, criteria for good measurement properties. So you can see for some of the measurement properties here, we can compare. So say for internal consistency, here you go, to be considered a good measurement property, we need at least low evidence for structural validity and a convex alpha greater than or equal to 0.7. So there is, I guess, standardized criteria to make an assessment about whether these properties are good enough. Okay. So once we've done that, we've applied the criteria for good measurement properties to our results. Ideally, we want to make some recommendations about the suitability of particular instruments. So does it have, and as I mentioned before, content validity is probably the most important instrument. So if I was going to recommend an instrument, I want to make sure that the content validity had been looked at and was considered sufficient, that the instrument was actually measuring what it should be measuring. Also, you need to be mindful that some instruments may be suitable for use in some populations, but not others. So it's not okay just to say, well, someone's tested an instrument and they've said it's valid, so I can use it. Because if you're using it in a different context or for a different population, then you need to also establish validity in that population. The case comes up also if an instrument is translated to a different language or used in a different country. Sometimes there needs to be some kind of cultural adaptation that would have to happen. And then the new modified version would have to be validated. So there is a lot to consider when making recommendations about whether instruments should or should not be used. In terms of assessing certainty in findings, the current approach recommended by COSMIN and in our JBI guide to use a modified grade approach. But this is also an area where there probably needs to be a bit more work done to look at actually how this works. I've put up a couple of example systematic reviews here. I just wanted to highlight that a very own student, Stephen Walters, has done a couple of these systematic reviews. So I'm hoping to deflect some difficult questions to him to answer if he's on the line. He's put a lot of work into this field and has done a lot of background reading in this area. They're not easy reviews to do, but I wasn't involved in this first one with him, but I've been involved in this systematic review here about measurement of fatigue in clinicians, which he's just recently finished and hopefully will be published soon. So it was a really interesting review to work on. So just to finish up, hopefully I've showed that systematic reviews are really important. They're an expanding field. The aim of the JBI guidance is really, essentially we are recommending a lot of the COSMIN methodology because they're the leaders in the field. But I guess we're trying to make the methodology a bit more accessible to people who don't have maybe the expertise in psychometrics. That's probably the main goal of our methodology group, and to help bring some consistency into how these reviews are conducted and reported.